Welcome to the attendees of the Bologna Italian Health Conference. Thank you to Supernatura for sponsoring me as a speaker to speak at your event. My name is Donald Adams. I'm also known as Doc Stars. It's a term of affection that members in our international group have given me. In this session, I'd want to present to you a new technology for self-improvement. It's unlike anything you've come across before. Nothing like it exists in the public domain on the planet currently. If you have a notepad and pen, I would suggest make that available, have it ready. I want to give you an overview of the work that I've been doing. I don't want to just sell you on a product or service. It's great if you find this a benefit, I'm sure that you will, but I want you to also have a good understanding as to what it is we're doing and how it works. So I'm going to cover a lot of information as quickly as I can. I'm not going to go super in depth with a lot of the topics, but I'm going to give a good overview so that you have even a technical grasp of the work that I'm doing, so that you have an understanding as to why it functions the way that it does. This is by a monk from the 1800s named Lu Huang. He said that every separate thought takes shape and becomes visible in color and form. This particular monk was involved with aspects of traditional Chinese medicine, inner alchemy, self-development. And this particular idea is not novel to him, but we see it in a variety of ancient cultures, and certainly poking through in different ways in contemporary times, in science, etc. I'm going to give you a little bit of backstory about myself. My academic background is computing science, and I've also been involved with alternative health and alternative science for about the last 30 years. Most of the work that I did was in the corporate world, so I worked as a contracting consultant for places like Microsoft headquarters in Seattle, Washington. And for the last 30 years, I've also been involved in research and investigation, application in alternative health sciences and also alternative science. So I've been on a lot of the different forums, especially forums related to Royal Rife frequencies. In the 1960s, there was an optical scientist named Royal Rife, and he made two discoveries. One was in microscopy, and the other was in frequency modulation applied to disease-causing organisms. Basically, what he was able to do is he created a microscope that allowed for much greater magnification, full color, and was able to view living processes. That's important because most microscopes were electron scanning microscopes, and they required that you used dead tissue that was stained, and you could usually only see it in black and white. So the amount of information was limited that you could get from that. And he also, in his frequency modulation, determined that you can kill, destroy, alter, modify germs by bombarding them or sending certain frequencies at them. And the concept is simple. It has to do with resonance. And so resonance is basically just an object or a mass or a thing is moving at a certain rate over time. That's the concept of frequency. So frequency itself is just something is moving at a certain rate of speed over time. Resonance comes into play when the rate of speed over time matches a fundamental inherent characteristic of the object itself. So a simple example is when you see an opera singer sing and she hits a certain musical note, a glass goblet or just a crystal drinking glass shatters. And the reason for that is that if we find the fundamental tone or note of an object, and if we represent that note and then play it back to the object at sufficient power over sufficient time, it causes what's called destructive interference. And interference is the interaction of frequencies. Probably the last 30 years, I've been exploring the work of Royal Rife. And Royal Rife designed a number of frequencies that were meant to be used towards health. He was successful at it. You could find lots of information on the net about it. He was persecuted by the American Medical Association. He and his work went underground. The work was sustained for a number of years, and it made it out to a number of small underground research rings, one of which I was a part of. So I developed, just through readily available materials and plans, my own Rife frequency generators, and I would experiment on tissue and biological samples, and was very happy with the results. And I was in correspondence with a number of well-known researchers in the field. The thing that I found odd was that in the entire time I was doing this, there was not a lot of research or development happening in relation to consciousness. So when we were investigating Rife frequencies, we were really just looking at the physical effects on organisms, like pathogenic organisms, single-celled organisms. You'd see like a paramecium, it's swimming along in the medium, and it's got a little tail whipping out, and then when the frequency hits it, it stops it, and then it's elliptical shaped, and as the frequency affects it, it starts to vibrate back and forth, and it starts to expand like a beach ball, like a big balloon, and then it bursts. And it would pass what's called the elastic recovery limit, and all the insights would come pouring out. And from my perspective, I wanted to understand and see if it was possible if frequencies could be used to affect behavior, moving from a low, devitalized state to a higher empowered state. Could someone be made to feel better in a short period of time? And there was a lot of reasons for this. Back around 2000, the year 2000, I made a discovery, and I didn't know what to make of it at the time. And with my background in computing sciences and my experience in alternative, health and alternative sciences, my interest was in determining whether there were certain specific informational patterns and geometries associated with emotions and thoughts, states of wellness, states of unwellness. At the time, I was putting together a theory, and the discovery that I made was a phenomena that seemed to associate certain numeric patterns with emotional and mental and physical states. I went looking through different literature online, white papers, scientific documents, and I couldn't find anything that really came close quite to what I was looking for. But I thought that if I was correct, that time would bring out research from others that would find parts or pieces of what I thought I was onto, and I would get confirmation for the assertions that I was making. And fortunately for me, very fortunately, that turned out to be the case. Over time, I began to see that there was a number of amazing bits of research being done, which confirmed, what I suspected. And I went back to my lab. I had a lab set up in the condo that I was living in, small lab, and I began to experiment. And the model that I was using was meant to represent internal states of an individual to see if we could forecast behavior. And I had a condition that I did not understand fully at the time. I had sore feet. So there would be times where in the center of the bottom of my feet, it would just start feeling sore. So if I was out, at a meeting or having dinner or at a cafe or at a pub with friends, I'd be sometimes standing, maybe holding a drink and just chatting, and it would just start to suddenly feel sore. So I thought, well, and it's not like the feet were sore all the time, just in certain situations. So I described the condition with numerical data in my model of what the sore feet felt like to me. And then using my model, I created a destructive interference informational pattern as a numeric data output stream. And then I took these numbers and I converted them to sound. And the process is called sonification. So it's just we convert numbers into an acoustic or sound-based representation. And it sounded weird, very, very simple, odd. And I let it play in the background. And after, it was playing for quite a while. It was relatively loud. And I was just doing chores in the house, you know, was doing some laundry, was reading a book. But I was on my feet, you know, running back and forth. And at the end of 3.5 hours, I had a very odd sensation in my feet. And it was like a almost unpleasant, but not quite, but like a mild burning sensation, like a tight ball of energy was releasing. You might imagine if you take tin foil or aluminum foil and you crumple it up in a ball and you let it go, it starts to kind of unravel. That was the sensation in my feet, and it was very intense. And the thing that really surprised me was that my sore feet literally never came back after that point in time. I only used that particular frequency once. And that's not to say I've never had sore feet since. I might get sore feet, but it was never like it originally was. So I put out a message to different alternative health forums asking for volunteers because I didn't know if what I was seeing was actually occurring or not. You know, I did not know at the time if it was psychosomatic. Was I imagining this? I didn't know. So our volunteer base grew. People were using the frequencies I developed, and they were excited, and they were reporting back very similar effects that I was experiencing. And so now, today, we have almost 5,000 members on our YouTube channel, and we have a bunch of online forums where people are using different kinds of frequencies for different kinds of things. So the basic idea is that whenever you have a thought or an emotion, your body is in a certain condition, that there is a very specific geometric form that exists in the mind that represents that state. So if you took 10 or 100 different people from completely different cultural backgrounds, and you could induce in them the state of joy, that state of joy could be described and mapped as a diagram, a complex diagram, to represent the state of joy. I want you to just imagine that you're in a room and there's a large piece of paper, and the piece of paper is 4 feet wide, and let's say that it's about 30 feet long. It's on the ground. And you have a little child's toy, a square wooden block. You take that square wooden block and you dip it in ink, like an ink pad. You cover the block in ink. Then you take that and you throw it against the paper on the ground. And so when the square hits the paper, it leaves an imprint. But the square is moving, so sometimes it might hit the paper face down, so you see the imprint of a square. But as it's moving and rotating, it might slide in one of its corners or edges, and it skids. And then it might pivot up, and it might land on the corner, so then you have what looks like a corner. So you have 20 to 30 feet of a sliding, ink-covered cube. Now you take the cube off, and you let the ink dry, and you have this pattern. You take this piece of paper, and then you show it to someone. And you ask the person, be a detective. By looking at the prints of this moving object, can you tell me what this object was? Someone might be able to use detective work and say, well, I can tell by trying to assemble this moving pattern into a shape that it's likely a cube. And by looking at how the cube is traveling across a piece of paper, we might be able to determine characteristics of the state the cube was in when it was thrown in the paper. For instance, how fast was the cube moving? How hard was, the cube impacting? What was the arc of travel? Did the person throw it high up in the air and then did it drop? Did they throw it at a certain angle? This is very similar to how the mind works, thought works. So in the mind, there is a space that exists where emotions become objects. And because they become objects, we can modify them. We can move them around. We can change them. And there's lots of references that exist in contemporary literature that seem to bear this out. Some of you in the audience may have heard of Emoto Musaru, who did work with analyzing how water changes through human intention. And in that case, you have test humans that are being evoked into a certain emotional mental state, and close by is a pan of water, and then the Japanese scientist Imaru, or Emoto Musaru, is taking the water and putting it into a flash freeze kiln. But what he found was that different mental emotional states were associated with different kinds of symmetries. So a negative state usually was asymmetrical, or it had very little structure or form. Positive states had a high degree of structure and form, often forming as snowflakes. The important thing here is that for an individual who wants to experience rapid positive state change, it becomes very convenient if you could literally have some recorded medium that had the state on it, so that when you played it back, you could evoke that state and get on with your day. Our group first started off where I created a number of frequencies, for different states. States that might be more joyous, happy, constructive, for self-achieving, peak performance, changing physical state. And the thing that's beneficial about that is that we're in a situation where not only can we listen to this audibly as sound, but we've also been developing tools to deliver these frequencies directly to the body through soundless or silent means. So imagine if we have an audio track, a sound track that's 10 minutes long, and we play it back through a small portable device. That device, instead of having headphones or instead of having a speaker, it has a special device that changes the sound into a varying magnetic field, small, weak magnetic field, or in some cases a small electromagnetic field. And this is held battery operated close to the body, and you just walk around with it. So you have like this little radius, a bubble of energy that you're bathing in as you go. These frequencies are experimental, and they are not approved as as a medical therapy, and they're really meant for personal research. But the stories that we've had back from users to date over the last 8 years have been incredible, and I would strongly encourage you to investigate this technology and give it a try. You can check out free samples. Supernatura has a lot of extra information and content that you can take advantage of. But the basic benefits are, instead of having to read a lot of self-help books or use awkward, tedious self-help routines, it's so convenient to be able to pop in a musical sounding track and have it lift you. And one of the things that I found in the early days, and this became very popular in our group, was that many people, and I have wrestled with this myself, go through life situations where you might have negative self-talk. It's like if you feel down or low, you get, like the Buddhists call it the monkey mind, where there's this like noise and chatter going on in your head, why you can't do something, why you aren't good enough. People are upset with you, you're upset with yourself. This becomes very disempowering. And one of the reasons I developed these tracks was that we can capture a positive state And through the process of resonance, where we're repeating something over and over again in a constructive way, we superimpose or place the new information pattern directly into the body. And these frequencies are naturally recognizable by the body. The body knows what these frequencies are. They recognize these sounds because these sounds actually come from the body, and they also have an influence from space. There's a component of astrology that exists in this work, but from a scientific basis, from a kind of a more Jungian archetype basis. There's a lot of fiction in astrology. Part of my process was I was raised in a religious home. Astrology was not encouraged, and we had a very dim, low view of the topic. And from my exposure to astrology, I wanted to see if I could get rid of the fiction, filter and screen out the stuff that was imaginary, and then look at whatever hard science might actually be underlying astrology. And that was largely successful. I was able to come across really good, solid scientific research into core principles in astrology. And I began to realize that what's happening out in space, you have enormous, massive stellar objects, planets, stars that are moving in relation to each other, and that the angles that they form with each other create special wave fronts of energy that come in and hit the planet. And then it affects things on the planet. And there's science, there's strong scientific literature to support this. I'm going to go over some of that briefly. And so these large objects, when they move in relation to each other, they broadcast very specific kinds of impulses. And when an organism, a biological organism, is exposed to these energetic impulses, it has a tendency to evoke or impel a behavioral reaction and other kinds of reactions as well. So what I found was that certain kinds of geometric relations in space that had associated energy field types to them would correspond to states in the human being. So, and then when I looked inside the human being, I found similar kinds of geometric relationships that would form in relation to emotions, mental states, physical conditions. There was a geometry coming from both ends. So we have an external domain of large, massive objects that are moving in relation to each other, creating an informational pattern. And then within the domain of an individual biological organism, we have objects moving in a hyperspace. The mind is part of that hyperspace, and that these energetic objects moving in relation to each other are also forming geometric relationships. But there's an interface. There is a zone of interface where the external influences meet the internal influences, and they create a superimposed resonant pattern. So imagine it like if you had a film screen that was somewhat translucent or transparent, and you could, on one side of the film screen, you could broadcast the information pattern coming from space, and then on the other side of the film screen, you could broadcast the informational pattern coming from inside the organism. You would have a complex geometry or pattern moving back and forth. Now, what I found is that these patterns have a commonality, or they have common characteristics across populations. Not everyone responds to these frequencies. Not everyone responds exactly the same. So far we've found that there's roughly about 20% on average of the using population that gets either, little to no response. And then the other 80%, there's a gradient. So I would say that out of 80%, probably about 65 of the 85% respond really well, super well. And then the remaining portion, it varies. So sometimes there's a really good reaction, and sometimes it's very average. But when I design a frequency, I attempt to design the frequency so that it fits the peak of that average. So if you're someone that responds well to different kinds of healing modalities, If you're a little bit sensitive and you can pick up information, there's a really good chance that you'll respond quickly and very dynamically. And if you're just the average person and you use the frequencies correctly, chances are they're probably going to affect you, really well as well. I want to go over some of the science so that you have some kind of a foundation and a very thorough understanding as to where this is coming from. And I want to share also some of the articles that have confirmed to me, in my mind, that this process is real and that it works. Are brains analog or digital? Mine should be thought of more as working the way biological organisms do, as a dynamic continuum cascading through shades of gray. The outside world is analog in many respects, so brains have to reflect that. But efficient and modular processing elements are digital, so brains ought to take advantage of that too. When the state of the system travels towards a frequently visited region of that space, the destination may constitute recognition of a particular word or a particular object. But on the way there, the majority of the mental trajectory is in intermediate regions of that space, revealing graded mixtures of mental states. Hyperspatial objects. I suggest that it is more useful to try to make a geometric model of consciousness, to take seriously the idea of a parallel continuum, and to say that the mind and the body are embedded in the dream, and the dream is a higher order spatial dimension. These are qualitative descriptions. He wonders if it is possible to develop quantitative spatial descriptions related to consciousness. He theorizes that human consciousness is in wave form and physically moves as such through the brain and beyond. He said further development of consciousness mechanics could form a grid of experience, along which consciousness proceeds towards its goal by making discriminations or associations at each juncture. So I love this. This was Brain Chaos article from Science A Go-Go. It was also posted at Cornell University and the Epoch Times, also the UK Register. So the way that article describes the state is very similar in so many ways to what I was initially researching and that I had postulated. So when I saw this article, I was just ecstatic in that it seemed to describe exactly what I was looking for. Now, there's another thing that's going on too, and this is fairly recent, at least insofar as a lot of the development, real development has gone. There has been a lot of innovation in brain music, or EEG music. A situation where the brain has electrodes attached to it, and activity is monitored and recorded, and then that activity, that recorded activity, is converted into sounds. And I've seen and heard a number of the videos that have been composed and put together by these developers, and it's very interesting. It's not identical to my work, but there are certainly similarities in how these things sound. They don't contain the same kind of meaningful dynamic information, but the brain music that people are experimenting with recently does give a very simple idea, as to the process where, activity that's occurring in the brain can be recorded and then listened to. And I want to also talk to you about how much your emotional state can affect your physical senses. And the reason for that is that when I was developing these frequencies, I wanted, ideally, because we have over 300 different frequencies, and what I'm attempting to do is model these states, like I mentioned, so that if you're in a negative state, you can just play this frequency, and through resonant entrainments, get a very fast state change. We're being constantly affected by all kinds of frequencies, and not all frequencies are positive. The frequencies that I developed are meant to be helpful and to improve vitality, and sometimes to address very specific desires, or states that we want to attain. But there's all kinds of negative frequencies around us. One example of this that shows the effect on biological organisms. It's called radar excitation dancing aphids. And what you see are a bunch of these insects, aphids. They're on a plant, and there's a massive radar system miles away, and it's pumping radar out into the atmosphere. You know, as a human being, you would never be consciously aware of all of these effects, like all of the noise in the background. But these little insects are moving, you know, in time with the radar pulses that their bodies are experiencing, and you can see it. There's a video that demonstrates this on YouTube. So, as a modern-day human being living in an urban environment, constantly we were exposed to cell phone, you know, towers, you know, microwave oven, you know, emissions. Wanted to explain also how astrology fits in to this picture. If we know that certain behavior states or tendencies can be described by the relationship of planets that are in outer space, is there any scientific background to this? A really good article that you can find easy online. It's simply called "Can Astrology Be a Science?" The author is A.P., I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, Velayudhan. It's spelled Velayudhan. And he lists an overwhelming number of citations and papers that are just absolutely stunning. But one that I wanted to share with you in particular was from a fellow who wrote a paper back in 1952. And the name of the article is J.H. Nelson, and is the author. And the paper is called "The Planetary Position Effect on Shortwave Signal Quality." And the body of work it was published in was Electrical Engineering, May 1952. And the abstract reads, "The shortwave radio signals interference registered by the planets on the Sun, Saturn, and Jupiter's effect on sunspot activity." And this is in quotes, "When Jupiter and Saturn were spaced by 120 degrees and solar activity was at a maximum, radio signals averaged far higher quality for the year than with Jupiter and Saturn at 180 degrees and a considerable decline in solar activity. In other words, the average quality curve of radio signals followed the cycle curve between Jupiter and Saturn rather than the sunspot curve." Now, the reason this paper was so important was that a very large company was experiencing power outages throughout the year, and they couldn't figure out where it was coming from or what was causing it. And they had very big cables, lots of wires and insulated cables underground, crisscrossed around the country, and they just have these blackouts, and they'd have to send maintenance people out there to try to fix it and figure out what was happening. So they hired this guy, Nelson, to study the problem and then get back to them. My understanding is that Nelson didn't believe in astrology, and he exhausted all the possible avenues as to where was this interference coming from. But he finally realized that when certain planets were moving in the sky at certain angles, that in most cases, that's when the power outages happened. And so they tried to figure out some way to block that. But he found that the faster moving planets, such as Mercury, and even positions of Mars, were some of the ones that were most instrumental in causing these blackouts. And so you think about this, if the position of planets in the sky emit some kind of influence that's strong enough to knock out hardware, like electronic hardware, how much more sensitive is the human body to this? And, you know, another thing that's interesting too is that there was another fellow that found that there was a correspondence to activity happening in the atmosphere of the planet and how a brainwave pattern, you know, works out in an EEG. So if we compare the pattern formation in an EEG to changes in the atmosphere, we see that there's an enormous correspondence. And that's just between a human being and the planet Earth, how the person felt on the inside. Nicholas Schultz, Soviet scientist, was able to show that human blood undergoes significant changes in proportion to the intensity of cosmic radiation. Samples taken from 1,200 people show that the sun's behavior was responsible for the increase or decrease of white blood corpuscles. Dr. Garcia Mata and Schaffner advances the theories that mass psychology is influenced by waves of optimism or pessimism caused by the variation in the amount of ultraviolet rays emitted by the sun. Changes in solar activity cause changes in electromagnetic fields of humans. Professor Dassier of the University of Frankfurt discovered that our emotions were materially affected by the nature of electrical charge of the air particles surrounding us, creating fluctuating moods. And this article it goes on and on with like amazingly solid references to how changes in the sky affect human behavior, emotions, the mind. So what I really wanted to do is I wanted to gain an understanding and develop a practical way of being able to self-determine, to change my own state and the states of other people towards a positive one when we're being bombarded by negative ones. So imagine if you're walking through a busy city and you're constantly bombarded by, there's that word called electrosmog, or just this like toxic influence of all kinds of electromagnetic radiation that's all around us. How can we filter that out? How can we make our own internal state more coherent? So when we play the sound of stars frequencies, each frequency literally, except for some of the substance emulations, in some cases I tried to model frequencies that represent certain substances. But in most cases, these frequencies, remember, they're a representation of something positive happening in the sky, almost like a photograph of what's happening in the sky converted into a frequency. Then we have an internal state that's also being represented as information, and we're blending the two. So imagine that you had that signal or that informational pattern, and then you could play it into your body. So now we have a way of introducing harmony directly and getting really, really fast, response, and being able to shield ourselves from external negative influences, and also being able to halt or block negative internal influences, or this monkey chatter, this background negative self-talk. Plato's theory of forms, these interactive force fields, give form to not just plants, animals, crystals, planets, and the like, but the behavioral and social patterns. This is similar to the evolving informational field concept described above, but even more profound. It is much like Carl Jung's collective unconscious understanding, but even broader, while on a somewhat more so-called scientific footing. But there is a new field of study that's been emerging the last few years, and it has to do with something called oscillons. And an oscillon is a pattern that you can see on a lake or a river when you're walking past it, if it's a good, clear, sunny day. And what you see are what look like, when you take a pebble, you drop it into a pond, and you see those circles, concentric circles kind of flowing out. Well, oscillons are naturally appearing patterns that appear on the surface of the water, and they almost look like circular tiles, and they're all undulating. So what we have there on a 2D surface, a liquid 2D surface, is an undulating pattern, a formation. And we also have a new concept coming out called a gyroid. And a gyroid is a physics term that describes a three-dimensional or higher state form that oscillons could fit inside of. And it looks almost like Swiss cheese. So imagine a piece of Swiss cheese with bubbles in it. And one could almost say that certain states of activity could be modeled as these oscillons, these moving kind of balls or patterns. So ultimately, if planets are affecting us, if their motions and angles to each other are affecting us, one has to ask through what medium. Well, the medium is probably not like singular. There's probably lots of ways the influence is affecting us. One is electromagnetically, but another is through gravitation. If there is a gravitational field that exists as a foundation that we're all immersed in, if that gravitational field changes, either in a small local way or in a large macroscopic way, then those changes can and likely do also affect our behavior. And so if we understand what the pattern of that gravitational change is, then we also have the potential opportunity to capture that pattern in a representational way, and then, basically use it whenever we want. So what I'm proposing, for some of you that have never heard of this before, there's a field of study called Cymatics. I've been studying it for probably about 15 years, and within the last 4 years, it's become a bit more popular in the public domain. So there's a good chance you've seen videos on it. And the basic idea is just that you have a flat plate, usually a steel plate, and it's situated horizontally, and then underneath the plate is a chamber, and in the chamber is a sound speaker, and the sound speaker emits a certain musical tone. On the plate is a thin layer of sand or powder, and the musical tone is played at a high enough volume so it causes movement of the powder. But what happens is the powder takes very specific geometric forms in relation to the musical tone that's played. So as you change the tone, the geometric pattern changes. But it should be kept in mind that the pattern that's forming on the plate is a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional phenomenon. We're just seeing an intersection of whatever that geometric object is that's associated with the sound. And so we can extend this idea of cymatics, and cymatics basically just means literally the shape of sound, to thought. What is the shape, not of sound, but what is the shape of thought? And something that's been missing, there are two researchers that I studied, was Hans Jenny and Ernst Chladni. And it was these individuals that were the pioneers in researching the shape of sound through different experiments. But then and now, there's a lot of really good work happening in cymatics currently. But what's missing is, okay, so we know what these shapes are, we can see them. We can play a certain sound and we can now see its shape. But what do the shapes mean? What is the meaning associated with the shapes? Now, here's something interesting too. Most of the interesting stuff I found in astrology are the obscure ideas, the ideas that most traditional astrologers are either not aware of, they have not put in the time or effort, to search through the really amazing and often ancient forms of astrological principles, or they may be aware of it and they just haven't applied it because it takes a little bit more work or effort. But a very interesting area of study that I've been heavily involved with is researching these geometric patterns that occur in space, and what we see is that cymatics, as we understand them in sound, these kinds of patterns are also forming in the sky. So we see cymatic patterns occurring between planetary bodies on a regular basis. And so an area that's been missing in the study of cymatics is, what do the shapes mean? And the area that I've been focusing on is trying to determine what is the information inherent in these patterns. What do these patterns mean, and what effect do they have on us? And so there's a number of authors that have described, for instance, the patterns that different planets make on their own as they travel, through their cycle in the sky, and also patterns that occur between planets as they travel through the sky. And so when I'm mapping these objects that correspond to thoughts and emotion, in most cases what I'm seeing is something very similar to a dynamic crystalline structure that's in constant movement. You recall at the beginning of this talk I was describing, imagine you had a flat piece of paper and you took a little child's square tube and you threw it across the paper. Well, this is essentially what happens in the domain of our mind. We have a very specific object representing characteristics of an experience, an emotion or thought that's moving, through that space of mind. This is what I'm mapping, and that's why it's so effective. There's a reason that we've grown to almost 5,000 members, in a relatively short period of time, and I'm finding that the overall response has just been amazing today.
Which kind of instrument did you use to record your frequencies?
Sure. All of the frequencies are using literally. Do you know the term from scratch, or it's equipment that I've developed? There's a special antenna with a special array that's used for detection, and it has an interface both to the body as well as for atmospheric energies. It's very similar to, you may have heard of the Secret Life of Plants. There was a fellow that made a small cube that has kind of like a gelatinous medium on the inside, and it's now used for. You can look it up online. It's called a biodynamic antenna array, and it's used in a lot of the deep space observatories. But the one that I developed is similar in function to that, but also different. There you are.
Ha risposto alla tua domanda? Ci sono altre domande? How did you transform numbers in frequencies?
There's a process in science. It's just called data sonification, and all that really means is just that any number can be converted into a sound. There's different ways of doing it. That process isn't special, and it's usually a kind of a common or mundane practice that scientists will use to understand or profile data that they're studying. But in my particular case, when I converted the numeric data into sound, instead of it just providing more understanding or information about the subject, it actually did things. It had an actual effect. And so from what I understand, the body is simply picking up that vibration. You know, I imagine if there were numbers that were written on a piece of paper, or you know, on a magnetic medium, if we read this, if I showed you a bunch of numbers that meant something to you consciously on a piece of paper, there would be some kind of a mental or emotional effect. For instance, let's say you know you go out for dinner to a restaurant, and the bill comes back, and you thought it was $40, but the waiter tells you it's $400. So those numbers in the paper, there's a connection. It has a big effect on you. But in this case, the numbers were representing processes that occur in the body and the mind. And so when those numbers were converted into sound, and by the way, they can be converted into other kinds of electromagnetic fields, such as you know, a magnetic field, a varying magnetic field, will have a similar effect as an acoustic wave.
Ha risposto? Ok, Doc. Thank you so much. Fate un applauso, per favore.
Nice to meet you.
Okay. So, goodbye.
Thank you, Alessandra.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Which kind of instrument did you use to record your frequencies?
That I've developed. There's a special antenna with a special array that's used for detection, and it has an interface both to the body as well as for atmospheric energies. It's very similar to, you may have heard of the Secret Life of Plants. There was a fellow that made a small cube that has kind of like a gelatinous medium on the inside, and it's now used for. You can look it up online. It's called a biodynamic antenna array, and it's used in a lot of the deep space observatories. But the one that I developed is similar in function to that, but also different.
there you are.
Ha risposto alla tua domanda? Ci sono altre domande? How did you transform numbers in frequencies?
There's a process in science, it's just called data sonification. And all that really means is just that any number can be converted into a sound. There's different ways of doing it. That process isn't special, and it's usually a kind of a common or mundane practice that scientists will use to understand or profile data that they're studying. But in my particular case, when I converted the numeric data into sound, instead of it just providing more understanding or information about the subject, it actually did things. It had an actual effect. And so from what I understand, the body is simply picking up that vibration. You know, I imagine if there were numbers that were written on a piece of paper or you know, on a magnetic medium, if we read this, if I showed you a bunch of numbers that meant something to you consciously on a piece of paper, there would be some kind of a mental or emotional effect. For instance, let's say you go out for dinner to a restaurant, and the bill comes back, and you thought it was $40, but the waiter tells you it's $400. So those numbers in the paper, there's a connection. It has a big effect on you. But in this case, the numbers were representing processes that occur in the body and the mind. And so when those numbers were converted into sound, and by the way, they can be converted into other kinds of electromagnetic fields, such as a magnetic field, a varying magnetic field, will have a similar effect as an acoustic wave.
Ha risposto? Ok, Doc. Thank you so much. Fate un applauso, per favore.
Nice to meet you.
Okay. So, goodbye.
Thank you, Alessandra.
Bye-bye.
Take care. This concludes this session for the Bologna Italian Health Conference. My thanks again to Supernatura for sponsoring me to speak at your event. Please feel free to take advantage of the resources made available to you by Supernatura. You can begin your journey and start discovering the powerful effects of these frequencies. Supernatura is providing CDs with some of the very best frequency tracks that we have, and you can contact your local representatives at the health conference there. I also strongly encourage you to check out Supernatura's website. You can have a large selection of individual frequencies, frequency collections, and access much more informational content. Again, thank you once again. It's been a pleasure to speak to the audience of this health conference. I wish you the very best in health, wellness, and self-actualization. Take care. This concludes this session for the Bologna Italian Health Conference. My thanks again to Supernatura for sponsoring me to speak at your event. Please feel free to take advantage of the resources made available to you by Supernatura. You can begin your journey and start discovering the powerful effects of these frequencies. Supernatura is providing CDs with some of the very best frequency tracks that we have, and you can contact your local representatives at the health conference there. I also strongly encourage you to check out Supernatura's website. You can have a large selection of individual frequencies, frequency collections, and access much more informational content. Again, thank you once again. It's been a pleasure to speak to the audience of this health conference. I wish you the very best in health, wellness, and self-actualization. Take care.